idea of vampires has captured the imaginations of humans for centuries. Something about these mysterious, blood-sucking creatures that prowl around at night has always fascinated us. Although this myth has European origins, tales of vampires came to the New World as settlers came over. One of these places with legends of the undead that I found most interesting is the city of New Orleans. New Orleans is known for its history with voodoo, but you might not be as familiar with its history with vampires. So, sit back as we explore New Orleans' tales of bloodsuckers. One of the earliest and possibly most popular legends regarding vampires in New Orleans is the legend of the Casket Girls. This story goes back to when New Orleans was still a French settlement in the 1700s. A group of nuns from the Company of St. Ursula came to New Orleans in 1727 and built a convent in the city, which still stands today. These nuns came to the Big Easy to become teachers and nurses. However, a new problem was arising. The men in New Orleans at the time were having trouble finding enough suitable women to marry, which was making it difficult for the French colony to grow. After all, if people weren't getting married, they also weren't having babies, or at least not legitimate ones. To solve this problem, the King of France declared he would send young women to New Orleans for them to be educated at the Ursuline convent, so they could be made into good wives and mothers. As these young ladies came to the colony, they brought with them suitcases called caskets, or cassettes. This is how they got the name Casket Girls. So the name has nothing to do with the modern meaning of the word casket, no matter how fitting it seems to be. The legend comes from one particular group of casket girls. When this group arrived, they were pale and gauntly, most likely caused by their trip to the colony. Rumors spread that these girls, either knowingly or not, brought vampires with them. There are plenty of different versions of this legend, but one claims that it was warned not to open their caskets until they were married, so the caskets were stored in the attic. In other versions, the caskets were opened to be found empty. Some legends claim that vampires were having trouble remaining hidden in Europe, so they decided to stow away in the caskets to come to the New World, where they would have more places to hide. Yet other versions say that the girls were the vampires. These claim that they were just pretending to be suitable wives as a cover for their true intent. They would actually sleep in their caskets during the day, then come out at night to hunt for victims. These stories have an exciting twist that carries into the modern day. They say the caskets are still in the attic with the girls sleeping in them during the day. They still come out every night to search for new prey, making sure to be back in the attic with the shutters shut by sunrise. I have to say, this story seems pretty easy to refute. While the story of the Casket Girls coming over from France is true, the girls from this story were probably just sick. After all, the voyage from France to Louisiana was a long and draining one. There's no need to add paranormal into the mix. Another story from New Orleans that piqued my interest was that of the Carter brothers. This one is a bit more recent, happening in 1932. I haven't been able to find primary sources on this tale, but it's still a popular legend, which makes it worth bringing up. This story starts with a girl running down Royal Street in terror. When stopped by a police officer, she told them that she had just escaped a house where two brothers had tied her and others up to drink their blood. The girl claimed she was only able to escape because the brothers had been careless when securing her ropes. Although skeptical of her story, the officer went with her back to the home, which was on the corner of Royal and St. Anne. To his surprise, he found 4 other victims there that were tied to chairs. They all had their wrists wrapped in bandages that were stained with blood. 2 more were wrapped in blankets in another room, dead. Before this next part, I want to give a potential trigger warning. I'll be describing what the brothers would do to their victims, which was quite gruesome and might be bad if you're sensitive to blood, knives, or injuries to wrists. A timestamp will be shown on screen for when this section ends. The victims told police that every evening the 2 men would come to their home and take the bandages off the girls' wrists. They would then reopen the wounds the girls were already inflicted with using a knife. Once blood began to flow, the brothers would catch the blood in cups to drink from. After they finished that, they would redress the wound. The girls said the men spoke very little during this and showed no concern. When the men returned home that evening, they were met by police. The officers were able to apprehend them fairly quickly, and the brothers confessed right away and begged to be killed. They claimed they were vampires and would have no other choice but to continue their actions if they were released. The pair were eventually executed. As crazy as it may seem for people to claim to have a need for drinking blood, there are actually some people today that identify as vampires and claim just this. These people don't claim to have any supernatural powers, just a medical condition that can only be controlled by drinking blood. There are at least 5,000 people in the United States who consider themselves to be vampires, about 50 of whom live in New Orleans. They claim symptoms begin to appear around puberty. Around this age, these vampires begin feeling tired and drained for no apparent reason. At some point, they end up finding that blood seems to fix this problem, usually by accident. For example, someone might accidentally bite their lip and realize the blood makes them feel better. This community is so prevalent in New Orleans that they even have their own organization, NOVA, or New Orleans Vampire Association. Every so-called vampire has a different method of feeding, or drinking blood. Again, if the talk of blood or needles makes you uncomfortable, you might want to skip this section. Another timestamp will be shown on screen for where you can skip to. However, if you're not very fazed by this subject, we'll be hearing how the Washington Post describes the feeding habits of one particular vampire. This vampire uses a disposable scalpel to make a tiny prick in a willing participant's back, then uses his fingers to press on the area until blood begins to flow. He then puts his mouth on the area where the blood is and drinks it. He repeats this process 2 to 3 times, then cleans the wound. Most vampires claim to need around 2 to 3 feedings each week. If they have more blood than they need for a single feeding, they store it in the refrigerator for later. Sometimes they even add stuff to it to improve the taste, like tea. Maybe these vampires are secretly British. Some vampires lean into their identity as portrayed by pop culture. Some will even have their teeth filed into points to appear as vampire teeth. If someone wishes to take this step, New Orleans has them covered. There's a place there called the Vampire Boutique that will do this procedure for their customers. Although some may be drawn to the allure of being in the vampire community, most claim they don't live like this by choice. For example, one vampire went to the hospital after 4 months without feeding. She had a low heart rate that would jump to 160 when she stood up. This was accompanied by a migraine and sometimes even losing consciousness. Thomas Gans, a medical doctor and professor at UCLA, once told BBC that the symptoms found in vampires could be caused by a strong placebo, stating, "There is likely a strong placebo effect akin to ingesting bitter powders, brightly colored liquids, or other substances that do not look or taste like conventional foods. This effect can be further enhanced if there is a ritual component associated with the ingestion, and if the individual feels a sense of some kind of exclusivity." While it seems odd a placebo could be this strong, one must admit that it seems more likely than there being actual vampires that need to drink blood to function. If the blood is actually doing something to help an underlying medical condition, what their body is lacking that the blood is able to supplement should be able to be shown on a test. In any case, it's interesting to learn about the people in this community. It surprised me when I went to New Orleans and saw places around the city centered around the vampiric community, such as the Vampire Boutique I mentioned earlier. I hope you found this journey through New Orleans' history of vampires as interesting as I did. It certainly seems to match the mood of this spooky season. If you enjoyed this video, please check out my other videos. If you're in a spooky mood, try watching my video on the Salem witch trials. Although that is an older video, so beware.